The river had nearly claimed her life, but somehow Josephine Bennett made it to the porch of the weathered cabin, just as her legs gave out beneath her, collapsing against the rough-hewn door with a sound that echoed through the Wyoming wilderness like a gunshot. Inside, Ethan Sullivan had been cleaning his rifle by lamplight when he heard the thud. He set the weapon down carefully, his calloused hand reaching for the pistol at his hip out of pure instinct. Living 15 miles outside of Anston in 1878 meant a man learned to be cautious about unexpected visitors, especially after dark. He moved to the window first, peering through the gap in the curtains, but saw nothing in the moonless night. Then came another sound, softer this time, like something sliding down the wooden door. Ethan crossed the small cabin in 3 strides and yanked the door open, catching the woman before she hit the porch entirely. She was soaked through to the bone, her dark hair plastered to her face, her lips tinged blue in the dim light spilling from inside. River water pooled beneath her, dripping from her heavy skirts. "Christ," he muttered, pulling her inside without hesitation. She was conscious, but barely, her eyes rolling as she tried to focus on his face. Her teeth chattered so violently he could hear them clicking together. Ethan kicked the door shut behind them and carried her to the stone hearth where embers still glowed from his evening fire. He laid her down on the worn rug and immediately set about building up the fire. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, adding kindling first, then larger pieces of split pine. The flames caught quickly, crackling to life and sending shadows dancing across the log walls. Only when the fire was roaring did he turn his full attention back to the woman. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with delicate features now pinched with cold. Her dress was once fine, he could tell that much, though the river had done its best to destroy it. The fabric clung to her frame, and he could see she was shivering so hard her whole body shook. "Can you hear me?" Ethan asked, leaning close. His voice was rough from disuse. He lived alone out here, days sometimes passing without him speaking to another soul. Her eyes found his, wide and dark. "CC cold," she managed through chattering teeth. "I know. We need to get you out of those wet clothes." He stood and moved to the small bedroom area, separated from the main room by only a curtain. He grabbed a wool blanket from his bed and one of his own shirts, the cleanest one he had. When he returned, she was trying to sit up, her arms shaking with the effort. "I will turn my back," Ethan said, keeping his tone matter of fact. "You need to remove those wet things and wrap yourself in this blanket. Can you manage that?" She nodded, still shaking, and he turned to face the wall. Behind him, he heard the rustle of wet fabric, small gasps as she struggled with buttons and laces. It took longer than it should have, and he could tell she was having trouble with her frozen fingers. Finally, she spoke. "I cannot manage the corset," she said, her voice small and embarrassed. "My hands will not work properly." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "All right, I will help, but only what is necessary." He turned around to find her wrapped in the blanket, her bare shoulders visible above it, her wet dress pooled on the floor. He knelt behind her and worked at the corset laces, trying to ignore how vulnerable she looked, how her skin was still so cold he could feel it radiating through the space between them. He loosened the laces enough that she could breathe properly, then quickly turned away again. "Finish getting that off and put on the shirt. It will be warmer once it is dry against your skin." He heard more rustling, then after a moment, "I am decent now." She sat huddled by the fire in his oversized shirt and wrapped in the blanket, looking like a half-drowned kitten. Her hair hung in wet ropes down her back. Ethan grabbed a second blanket and draped it over her shoulders, then went to put a kettle on the hook over the fire. "What happened?" he asked, settling himself on the floor near her but maintaining a respectful distance. "How did you end up in the river?" Her eyes welled with tears, though whether from relief or something else he could not tell. "The stagecoach," she said, her voice still shaky but stronger now. "We were crossing at the ford about 3 miles upstream. The driver misjudged the current. The whole coach tipped." Ethan's expression darkened. "When was this?" "This afternoon. Maybe 2 o'clock." She pulled the blankets tighter. "I was swept downstream. I tried to grab onto rocks, branches, anything. I finally caught hold of a fallen tree and pulled myself out, but I was so far from the road. I just started walking, hoping to find help before nightfall. The others in the coach," her face crumpled. "There was an older couple and the driver. I saw the woman go under and not come back up. I do not know about the others. I could not see them once I was in the water." Ethan stood and moved to the window, his jaw tight. 3 miles upstream meant the bodies, if there were bodies, would have washed past his property hours ago. There was nothing to be done about it tonight, not in the darkness. Come morning, he would ride into Evanston and alert the marshal. "You walked 3 miles in wet clothes?" he asked, turning back to her. "I did not know what else to do. I was so cold I thought I would die if I stopped moving. Then I saw your light." A tear rolled down her cheek. "I thought it might be a dream. I have been seeing things for the last hour that were not there." The kettle began to whistle. Ethan poured hot water into a tin cup and added some dried mint leaves from a jar on the shelf. He handed it to her carefully. "Drink this slowly. It will help warm you from the inside." She wrapped her hands around the cup, wincing as the warmth met her frozen fingers. "Thank you. I do not even know your name." "Ethan Sullivan. Josephine Bennett. Everyone calls me Josie." She sipped the tea, and some color began to return to her cheeks. "I was traveling to Evanston to take a position as a school teacher. Long way to come for a teaching job. I am from Massachusetts. My father died 6 months ago. He left debts, and I needed to find employment that paid better than what I could find back home." She looked around the cabin, taking in the rough furniture, the guns on the wall, the simple but tidy space. "You live here alone?" "I do. I have a small ranch, horses mostly, some cattle. I sell to the army fort when they need mounts." He pulled up a wooden chair and sat down, studying her. Even bedraggled and half-frozen, she was striking. Her eyes held intelligence and determination, and something else, a sadness that seemed deeper than just this day's tragedy. "You have people expecting you in Evanston," the school board chairman, Mr. Whitmore. "He will be wondering why I did not arrive on today's stage." She closed her eyes. "My trunk was on that coach. Everything I owned was in it. My mother's jewelry, my clothes, my books. The river might give some of it back. Sometimes things wash up on the banks downstream. I will look tomorrow." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the fire crackling between them. Josie's shivering was finally beginning to subside, though she still clutched the blankets tightly. Ethan found himself studying her face in the firelight, the elegant line of her jaw, the way her dark lashes cast shadows on her cheeks. "You should rest," he said finally. "You can take the bed. I will sleep out here by the fire." "I cannot take your bed. You have already done so much." "I insist. You have been through an ordeal and you need proper rest." He stood and added another log to the fire. "Come morning, I will take you into town. It is about a 2-hour ride." Josie set down the teacup and stood slowly, testing her legs. She was steadier now, the warmth from the fire and the hot drink working their magic. "I do not know how to thank you, Mr. Sullivan. You saved my life tonight." "Ethan," he corrected. "And you saved your own life by making it this far. I just provided the fire and dry clothes." She smiled then, a small, tired smile that somehow transformed her whole face. "Nevertheless, I am grateful." He showed her to the bedroom area, where a simple rope bed stood covered with quilts. "I apologize for the modest accommodations. It looks like heaven to me right now," she said honestly. She paused at the curtain. "Ethan, were you ever frightened out here alone?" The question surprised him. "Sometimes, early on, you get used to it. Why do you ask?" "I have never been so frightened as I was in that river. The water just kept pulling at me, dragging me down. I could not fight it." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I thought I was going to die." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. "But you did not. You fought and you survived. That takes more courage than most people ever have to find in themselves." He met her eyes. "Get some sleep, Josie. You are safe now." She nodded and disappeared behind the curtain. Ethan returned to the main room and settled himself in his chair by the fire, a blanket across his lap. Sleep would not come easy tonight, he knew. His mind was too full of questions and concerns. 3 people missing, maybe drowned. A woman who appeared at his door like something out of a dream. He ran a hand through his dark hair and stared into the flames. It had been 3 years since he had left Kansas and come to Wyoming to start over. 3 years since he had buried the past and vowed to live a simpler life, away from the complications that came with caring too much about other people. He had his horses, his land, and his solitude. That had been enough. But now there was a beautiful woman sleeping in his bed, wearing his shirt, and something in him had shifted the moment he pulled her inside. He recognized the danger in it, that pull toward another person, that desire to protect and care for someone. It was the kind of thing that could upend a carefully ordered life. The fire popped and settled. In the bedroom, he heard Josie shift in the bed, a small sigh escaping her. Ethan closed his eyes and willed himself to think of practical matters. Tomorrow he would need to ride to town, report the accident, make sure Josie got settled. Then she would go on with her life as a schoolteacher and he would return to his ranch. Simple, clean, no complications. But even as he told himself this, he knew it was already too late. Something had changed in those moments when he carried her inside, when he had looked into her eyes and seen her fear and her strength mixed together. He had felt it like a hook catching in his chest, sharp and undeniable. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Ethan pulled the blanket tighter and settled deeper into his chair. It would be a long night, when dawn broke across the Wyoming landscape, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink. Ethan was already awake and moving quietly around the cabin. He had managed a few hours of restless sleep, but the habit of rising early was too ingrained to break. He built up the fire and put coffee on to boil, then went outside to tend to his horses. The morning air was crisp and clean, washed fresh by the recent rains upstream. That explained the swollen river, the treacherous crossing. Ethan fed his horses and checked their hooves, his mind already planning the day ahead. He would need to hitch up the wagon rather than ride on horseback. Josie would need something more comfortable than a horse after what she had been through. When he came back inside, she was awake and standing by the fire, still wrapped in his blankets. Her hair had dried overnight into dark waves that fell past her shoulders. She looked younger in the morning light and more vulnerable. "Good morning," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," she admitted. "Every muscle in my body aches, but warmer." She managed a small smile. "And alive, which seems like a considerable improvement over yesterday." Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. "I have bacon and eggs if you are hungry. It is not fancy, but it is filling." "That sounds wonderful." She sat down at the small table, wrapping her hands around the coffee cup. "I realized I did not eat anything yesterday. I was too nervous about the journey." He cooked breakfast in a cast iron skillet, the bacon sizzling and filling the cabin with its rich aroma. They ate together in companionable silence, and Ethan found himself sneaking glances at her across the table. In the morning light, He could see details he had missed the night before. A small scar on her left eyebrow, the determined set of her chin, the way her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup absently as she thought. "I have been thinking about the others from the stagecoach," she said quietly. "The couple, the driver. Do you think there is any chance they survived? I hope so, but I will not lie to you. The Green River is dangerous this time of year, especially after heavy rain. If they went under and got pulled into the current like you did, well." He did not finish the thought. He did not need to. The woman's name was Martha. "She told me she and her husband were going to visit their daughter in Utah. They had a new grandchild they had never met." Josie's eyes glistened. "She showed me a little blanket she had knitted. It was yellow with white flowers." Ethan reached across the table and covered her hand with his, a gesture that surprised them both. "You cannot carry that burden. What happened was an accident. The driver should have known better than to cross when the water was running high, but I am sure he was just trying to keep to his schedule." "I know, but it does not make it easier." She looked down at his hand covering hers, and he quickly withdrew it, feeling heat rise in his face. "I will hitch up the wagon. We should get you into town." He stood abruptly and grabbed his hat. "I have some clothes that belong to my sister. She left them here when she visited last year. They might fit you well enough for the ride." He disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a simple cotton dress in a soft blue color and a bonnet. "These should work." Josie took them gratefully. "You have a sister. Does she live nearby?" "She is in Montana now. Married a rancher up there. I do not see her often, but we write letters." He moved toward the door. "I will be outside getting the wagon ready. Take your time." Outside, Ethan harnessed his best horse to the wagon, checking all the straps twice to make sure everything was secure. His hands worked automatically while his mind wandered. He had not touched a woman like that, not even in comfort, in years. Not since Rebecca. The memory of her still hurt, even after all this time. The way she had looked at him when she said she could not marry a man who lived by his gun. The way she had chosen safety and society over the life they could have had together. That was when he left Kansas, when he came out here to build something new. Something that was just his, that could not be taken away by someone else's choices. And he had succeeded. He had a good life, simple but honest. He did not need complications. But then, why did his hand still tingle where it had touched Josie's? Why did he find himself wanting to make her smile again, to chase away the sadness in her eyes? The cabin door opened and Josie emerged, wearing his sister's dress. It fit her well, though she had to hold the skirts up slightly as she walked. She had braided her hair and pinned it up, and the bonnet shaded her face from the morning sun. "Ready?" he asked, offering his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. "As I will ever be," she said, taking his hand. Her fingers were warm now, a stark contrast to the icy touch from the night before. They set off down the rutted trail toward Evanston, the wagon bouncing over rocks and through shallow creek beds. The landscape stretched out around them in shades of sage green and brown, punctuated by stands of pine and the distant purple shadows of mountains. It was beautiful country, wild and untamed, and Ethan never tired of looking at it. "How long have you lived here?" Josie asked, breaking the silence. 3 years this fall. I bought the land from a man who gave up and went back east. He had started to build the cabin but never finished. I spent my first winter completing it. That must have been difficult. It was, but I wanted to prove I could do it. I wanted to prove I could build something lasting. He glanced at her. "What made you decide to come all the way to Wyoming to teach?" "Necessity at first," she said, "but also curiosity. I read everything I could find about the Western Territories. It seemed like a place where a person could reinvent themselves, become something more than what society expected." She smiled wryly. I suppose that sounds foolish. No, I understand it completely. That is why I came here too. They talked easily as the wagon rolled along, sharing pieces of their pasts like travelers exchanging coins. Josie told him about her childhood in Massachusetts, her father's bookshop, her mother who had died when she was 12. Ethan spoke about growing up on a farm in Kansas, learning to ride before he could walk, the years he spent working as a deputy marshal before deciding that life was not for him. A lawman. Josie looked at him with new interest. Why did you leave that behind? It changes you wearing a badge. You see the worst in people day after day. After a while, you start to forget there is any good left in the world. He was quiet for a moment. I wanted to remember what it felt like to trust people again, to build instead of just enforce. And have you remembered? He looked at her, really looked at her, and felt that hook in his chest tug again. I am starting to. As they crested a hill, the town of Evanston came into view below them, sprawled along the railroad tracks like a collection of children's blocks. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and even from this distance they could hear the faint sounds of activity, hammers ringing, dogs barking, the whistle of a train. There it is, Ethan said. Your new home. Josie stared at the town with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. It looks smaller than I imagined. About 800 people last I heard, but it is growing. The railroad brought a lot of business through here. He guided the horse down the hill toward the main street. First stop should be the marshal's office. We need to report the accident. Marshal Tom Bradshaw was a solid man in his 50s, with a thick mustache and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened to Josie's account of the stagecoach accident with increasing concern, making notes in a leather journal. That is the third crossing accident this month, he said when she finished. I have been telling the stage company they need to wait for better conditions, but they insist on keeping their schedule. He looked at Josie with sympathy. You were lucky, Miss Bennett, very lucky. I will get some men together and ride out to search for the others and see what we can recover. Did you say your trunk was on the coach? Yes, sir. It was brown leather with brass corners and my initials on the side. J.M.B. We will do what we can. He turned to Ethan. I appreciate you bringing her in, Sullivan. That is a good piece of land you have out there. Quiet. I like quiet, Ethan said. I know you do. That is why you live 15 miles from town. The marshal's eyes crinkled with something like humor. Miss Bennett, do you have a place to stay while we get this sorted out? Josie's face fell. I had not thought that far ahead. I was supposed to meet with Mr. Whitmore, the school board chairman. He was arranging lodgings for me. Whitmore's wife died last winter, and he is staying with his daughter over in Ogden right now. But Mrs. Patterson runs a boarding house on 3rd Street. I am sure she has room. Clean sheets, good food, and she does not tolerate any nonsense from her boarders. Ethan felt an unexpected reluctance to leave Josie here, to walk away and return to his solitary life. But what choice did he have? She had her own path to follow, her own life to build. He had no claim on her, no right to her time or attention. Let me take you to the boarding house, he said. Make sure you get settled properly. Mrs. Patterson was a plump woman with rosy cheeks and a brisk, no-nonsense manner. She looked Josie up and down with an assessing eye and then nodded. I have a room on the 2nd floor, faces east so you get good morning light. $3 a week includes breakfast and dinner. Laundry is extra. That sounds perfect, Josie said, though I must be honest with you. All my belongings were lost in the stagecoach accident yesterday. I have no money with me right now. The bank draft from my employer was in my trunk. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. I heard about the accident. Terrible thing. You are the school teacher, are you not? Yes, madam. Well, we have been needing a good teacher around here. The last one lasted 3 months before he gave up and went back east. Could not handle the children. She waved a hand dismissively. You can owe me for the first week. I trust you are good for it. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I truly appreciate your kindness. Ethan stood by the door, his hat in his hands, feeling more and more like an intruder in this moment. Josie would be fine here. She would start her teaching job, build a life in Evanston, meet people, make friends. She did not need a solitary rancher who lived 15 miles from town. But when Josie turned to him, her eyes held something that made his breath catch. Will you stay for lunch? She asked. It is the least I can do after everything you have done for me. I should get back to the ranch, he said, even as he wanted to say yes. The horses need tending. Please. She stepped closer, and he caught the faint scent of the lavender soap he kept in his cabin. I would like to hear more about the area. You could tell me what to expect from the town, the people. Mrs. Patterson made the decision for him. Lunch will be ready in an hour. You might as well stay, Mr. Sullivan. No sense making that trip back on an empty stomach. So Ethan stayed. They ate lunch at Mrs. Patterson's long dining table along with 4 other boarders, a telegraph operator, a young clerk from the general store, a widow who taught piano lessons, and a railroad surveyor passing through. The conversation flowed around them, talk of politics and weather and the latest gossip from town. Josie fit in naturally, asking questions, laughing at jokes, her earlier trauma fading into the background. Ethan found himself watching her more than eating. The way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear when she listened intently. The way her whole face lit up when she smiled. The way she unconsciously leaned toward him whenever he spoke, as if his words mattered more than anyone else's. After lunch, he walked with her out onto the boarding house porch. The afternoon sun was warm, and the street was busy with people going about their business. A freight wagon rumbled past, and somewhere a blacksmith's hammer rang against an anvil. Thank you again for everything, Josie said. I know I keep saying it, but I do not know how else to express what you did for me. You do not need to thank me anymore, Ethan said. Any decent person would have done the same. But you did it. You took me in, kept me safe, brought me here. That means something. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, neither quite ready to say goodbye. Finally, Ethan settled his hat on his head and forced himself to turn toward the steps. Ethan, her voice stopped him. Will you come back to visit? I would like to know how the horses are doing. And I would enjoy hearing more of your stories about the territory. He looked back at her. This woman who had stumbled into his life less than 24 hours ago and somehow already left a mark on it. I come into town every few weeks for supplies. I could stop by and see how you are settling in. I would like that very much. He nodded, not trusting himself to say more, and descended the steps to his wagon. As he drove away, he looked back once to see her still standing on the porch, watching him go. She raised one hand in farewell, and he did the same. The ride back to his ranch felt longer than the ride into town. The landscape that usually brought him peace now seemed empty and lonely. He tried to focus on the practical matters that awaited him, the fence that needed mending, the new foals that would be ready to start training soon, the hay that needed cutting. But his mind kept drifting back to dark eyes and a tentative smile, to the feeling of Josie's hand in his, to the way she said his name. By the time he reached his cabin, the sun was lowering toward the western mountains, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. Ethan unhitched the horse and saw to its care, then stood for a moment looking at his home. It looked just as it always did, solid and simple and sufficient. But something felt different now. For the first time since he built this place, it felt empty. He went inside and saw Josie's wet dress still hanging by the fire where they had left it to dry. Without thinking, he picked it up and folded it carefully, setting it on the table. Then he stood there like a fool, staring at a piece of damp cloth as if it held some kind of answer. "You are in trouble," he said aloud to the empty room. "Real trouble." But even as he acknowledged it, he could not quite bring himself to regret it. Something had shifted in him when he pulled Josephine Bennett out of the night and into his home. Some door he had thought permanently closed had opened again, and he was not sure he wanted to shut it. The days that followed fell into their old, familiar pattern. Ethan worked his ranch, rising before dawn to feed horses and mend fence, breaking the new foals to lead and saddle, cutting hay in the meadow by the creek. The work was hard and endless, the way he liked it. It kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. But in the evenings, when he sat by the fire with his coffee, his thoughts inevitably drifted to Evanston. He wondered how Josie was settling in, whether she had started teaching yet, if the town was treating her well. He found himself planning reasons to go into town. Supplies he needed that he did not really need, tools he could check on at the blacksmith shop. 2 weeks after he brought her to Evanston, Ethan finally gave in to the pull and hitched up his wagon. He told himself he was just going for supplies, that stopping by Mrs. Patterson's boarding house would be a natural thing to do, a friendly gesture and nothing more. The town was busy when he arrived, the streets crowded with miners and railroad workers on their day off. He conducted his business at the general store first, buying flour and sugar and coffee, a new coil of rope, some nails he actually did need. Then, with his purchases loaded in the wagon, he made his way to 3rd Street. Mrs. Patterson answered his knock with a knowing smile. "Mr. Sullivan." "What a pleasant surprise. I suppose you are here to see our Miss Bennett." "I was in town for supplies," Ethan said, feeling like a boy caught stealing apples. "I thought I would check how she was settling in." "Of course you did." The landlady's eyes twinkled. "She is just finishing up her afternoon lessons. The school is on the corner of Main and 5th, the white building with the bell tower. You cannot miss it." Ethan thanked her and walked to the school, feeling more nervous with each step. This was foolish, he told himself. She was probably busy. She might not even want to see him. He should just go back to his ranch and forget this whole idea. But then he heard her voice through the open windows of the schoolhouse, clear and patient as she explained something about arithmetic. He found himself drawn to the sound like a moth to flame. He stopped outside and listened, not wanting to interrupt. "Very good, Thomas. Now who can tell me what 7 times 8 equals?" A chorus of young voices called out answers, some right, some wildly wrong. Josie laughed, a sound that made Ethan's chest feel tight. "Sarah, that is correct." 56. "Well done." The lesson continued for another few minutes, then came the sound of desks scraping, children's excited chatter as they were dismissed. They poured out the door in a flood, boys and girls ranging from about 6 to 14, some of them giving Ethan curious looks as they passed. Then Josie appeared in the doorway, and her face lit up when she saw him. "Ethan, what a wonderful surprise." She looked different than she had 2 weeks ago, more confident, more settled. Her hair was pinned up in a neat bun, and she wore a green dress he had not seen before, but her smile was the same, warm and genuine. "I was in town for supplies," he said, the excuse sounding thin even to his own ears. "I thought I would see how you were doing." "I am so glad you did. Come inside, let me show you the school." She led him into the one-room building with its rows of desks, its slate board across the front wall, the pot-bellied stove in the corner that would be essential come winter. Books lined shelves along one wall and children's drawings decorated the others. "It is not much," she said, "but the children are wonderful. challenging sometimes, but eager to learn. I have 32 students ranging from 6 to 15 years old. That is a lot to manage on your own. It keeps me busy, which I appreciate. The days go by quickly. She smiled at him. Mrs. Patterson told me the marshal found my trunk. Most of my things were ruined by the water, but a few items survived. My mother's cameo necklace was in a tin box that kept it safe. That meant more to me than everything else combined. That is good news. And the others from the stagecoach, her smile faded. They found the driver's body about 5 miles downstream. The couple is still missing. The marshal thinks they probably did not survive either, but he is still looking. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of that tragedy hanging between them. Then Josie seemed to shake herself and brightened. But you did not come here to discuss sad things. Have you eaten lunch? There is a restaurant on Main Street that serves an excellent stew. They walked together to the restaurant, and Ethan found himself hyper-aware of her presence beside him. The way people watched them pass, the speculation in their eyes. The way Josie nodded and smiled at people she recognized, already becoming part of the town's fabric. Over bowls of beef stew and thick slices of bread, they talked about everything and nothing. Josie told him about her students, the challenges of teaching such a wide range of ages, the satisfaction of seeing a difficult concept finally click in a child's mind. Ethan spoke about the ranch, the new foals that were showing promise, the mountain lion he had spotted near his northern boundary. "Are you not frightened, living alone so far from town?" Josie asked. "I was at first. But you learn the sounds of the land, what is normal and what is not. And I have my guns if trouble comes calling." He buttered a piece of bread. "Are you not frightened being here in a strange town, knowing no one?" "Terrified," she admitted with a laugh, "but also exhilarated. Every day is an adventure. Every person I meet is a potential friend. Or enemy, I suppose, but I prefer to think positively." "That is a good way to approach life." She studied him across the table. "You are different than I expected, Ethan Sullivan." "How so?" "When you first opened your door that night, you looked so stern. I thought you might be cruel or harsh. But you are neither of those things. You are kind, thoughtful, and you actually listen when people speak. That is rarer than you might think." Ethan felt heat rise in his face. He was not used to such direct compliments. "I just treat people the way I would want to be treated." "Which makes you uncommon in this world." She reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. "I am glad you came to check on me." They finished their meal and walked back toward the boarding house, neither of them in a hurry. The afternoon sun slanted low across the street, and a cool breeze had picked up, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains. "Will you come back?" Josie asked as they reached Mrs. Patterson's porch. "I know the ranch keeps you busy, but I would enjoy seeing you again." "I will come when I can," Ethan promised. "It may not be every week, but I will visit. That is all I ask." She smiled at him, then did something that surprised them both. She stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, a brief touch of her lips against his skin. "Thank you for thinking of me." Then she was gone, slipping inside the boarding house before he could respond. Ethan stood on the street touching his cheek where she had kissed him, feeling like he had been struck by lightning. He drove back to his ranch in a daze, that small kiss occupying his thoughts far more than it probably should have. It was just a friendly gesture, he told himself. A thank you between people who were becoming friends. It did not mean anything more than that. But he could not quite convince himself. And the truth was, he did not want to. The pattern continued over the next 2 months. Every 2 weeks, sometimes sooner, Ethan found reasons to go into Evanston. He told himself it was necessary, that he needed supplies or had business with the blacksmith, or wanted to check on the news from town. But he always ended up at the schoolhouse, timing his arrival for when Josie would be finishing lessons. They fell into an easy companionship, sharing meals at the restaurant, walking through town together, talking about their lives and dreams. Josie told him about the progress her students were making, about the school board meeting where they praised her teaching methods, about the families who were beginning to invite her to Sunday dinners. Ethan shared stories about the ranch, about the wolves that had been prowling near his cattle, about the spectacular thunderstorm that had rolled through last week. But they did not speak about what was growing between them, that magnetic pull that drew them together despite all the practical reasons they should remain just friends. Josie had her life in town, her teaching position, her growing circle of acquaintances. Ethan had his ranch, his horses, his carefully chosen solitude. There was no logical way to reconcile those two paths, yet every time they parted, the separation felt harder. Every time Ethan rode back to his ranch alone, the emptiness there felt more profound. It was Mrs. Patterson who finally brought the unspoken truth into the open. Ethan had just finished lunch at the boarding house one October afternoon, and Josie had gone upstairs to fetch a book she wanted to lend him. The landlady cornered him in the parlor with a direct look. "Mr. Sullivan, I am going to speak plainly because that is my way. You have been courting our Miss Bennett for 2 months now, and the whole town knows it." "I have not been courting her," Ethan protested weakly. "We are friends." "Friends," Mrs. Patterson snorted. "That girl looks at you like you hung the moon, and you look at her like she is the only person in the world. If that is friendship, then I am the Queen of England. It is complicated. It is only complicated if you make it so." She softened slightly. "I have seen a lot of people pass through this town, Mr. Sullivan. Some of them find what they are looking for, and some of them let it slip away out of fear or stubbornness. You strike me as a good man who has been hurt before. But that does not mean you should hide from happiness when it comes knocking." Ethan stared at the woman, her words hitting closer to home than was comfortable. "She has a life here, a good position. I cannot ask her to give that up for a lonely ranch 15 miles from nowhere." "Have you asked her what she wants? Or are you just assuming you know?" Before Ethan could answer, Josie returned with the book, and the conversation ended. But Mrs. Patterson's words stayed with him as he rode home that evening, echoing in his mind like a challenge he could not ignore. What did he want? That was the question he had been avoiding. He wanted Josie, wanted her with an intensity that frightened him. He wanted to wake up to her smile every morning, to share his days and his dreams with her, to build a life together. But wanting something and having the courage to reach for it were two different things. The night was cool and clear, stars spreading across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Ethan sat on his porch long after he should have gone to bed, wrestling with his thoughts and fears. Rebecca had rejected him because she did not want the life he offered. What if Josie felt the same? What if he opened his heart only to have it broken again? But what if she did not? What if she wanted the same things he did? Mrs. Patterson was right about one thing. He would never know unless he asked. The next morning, Ethan woke with a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. He spent the day working with unusual energy, finishing all his essential tasks by mid-afternoon. Then he cleaned himself up, put on his best shirt, and saddled his fastest horse. He reached Evanston just as the school day was ending, and he waited outside like he always did, watching children pour out into the autumn afternoon. When Josie appeared, she looked surprised to see him. "Ethan, I did not expect you until next week." "I know. I needed to talk to you." "Can you spare some time?" Something in his tone must have conveyed his seriousness because she nodded immediately. "Of course. Let me lock up the school." They walked to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land. The sun was lowering, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Ethan stopped near a stand of cottonwood trees, their leaves golden and whispering in the breeze. "I have been thinking," he started, then stopped, unsure how to put his feelings into words. "When you showed up at my door that night 2 months ago, soaked from the river and half frozen, something changed for me. I did not recognize it at first, but I know it now." Josie watched him with wide eyes, saying nothing, letting him work through what he needed to say. "I came out here 3 years ago because I wanted to be alone. I wanted a life that was simple and uncomplicated, where I did not have to worry about getting hurt or disappointed. And I built that life. I built exactly what I thought I wanted." He took a breath. "But then you came along, and suddenly what I thought I wanted is not enough anymore." "Ethan," she whispered, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish before I lose my nerve. I know you have a life here, a position you worked hard to get, friends, and a place in this community. I know I have no right to ask you to give any of that up, but I need you to know how I feel." He stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "I am in love with you, Josie. I think I started falling the moment I pulled you inside my cabin. Every day since then it has just grown stronger." Tears welled in her eyes, but she was smiling. "Oh, Ethan, do you really not know?" "Know what? I am in love with you too. I have been for weeks now. I thought I was hiding it well, but apparently Mrs. Patterson saw right through me." She laughed, a slightly watery sound. "Every day that you did not come to town felt endless. Every time you left to go back to your ranch, I wanted to go with you." Relief and joy flooded through Ethan in equal measure. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. "You do not have to give up teaching. We could make it work somehow. You could keep your position in town, and I could, Ethan." She put her fingers against his lips, stopping his words. "I do not want to live in town if you are not here. I do not want to spend my days counting the hours until you might visit. When I came west, I was looking for a new life, a new purpose. I thought I found it in teaching, but what I really found was you. Are you certain? Teaching means so much to you." "It does, but you mean more." She smiled up at him. "Besides, there are children everywhere who need teaching. Maybe someday we will have our own children who will need a teacher. Until then, I can teach the children of ranch families in the area. I can find a way to do what I love while building a life with you." Ethan felt like his heart might burst. "Josie Bennett, will you marry me? Will you come live on my ranch and let me spend every day trying to make you happy?" "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then, there under the cottonwood trees with the sunset painting the sky behind them. It was not his first kiss, but it felt like the first one that truly mattered, the first one that promised forever. Josie melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and for a long moment the whole world fell away until there was nothing but the two of them and this perfect, crystalline feeling of rightness. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Josie laughed. "Mrs. Patterson is going to be insufferably smug about this." Let her be smug. She was right. Ethan kept his arms around Josie, not ready to let her go yet. "How soon can we get married?" "How soon do you want to?" "Tomorrow," she laughed again. "I need at least a few weeks. I have to give the school board notice so they can find a replacement teacher, and I should have a proper dress, and we need to arrange for a preacher. A few weeks then, but not a day longer than necessary." They walked back into town hand in hand, both of them grinning like fools. The news of their engagement spread through Evanston faster than wildfire. By the time they reached Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, half the town seemed to know, and people were stopping them on the street to offer congratulations. Mrs. Patterson took one look at their joined hands and clasped faces and nodded with satisfaction. "About time you two figured it out. I was beginning to think I would need to lock you in a room together until you came to your senses." "You were right," Ethan admitted. "I was making it complicated when it did not need to be. Of course I was right. I am always right about these things." She beamed at them both. "Well, this calls for a celebration. Come inside, I will make tea, and we can start planning this wedding properly." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Josie gave her notice to the school board, who were disappointed to lose her but understanding. They promised to write her a glowing reference should she ever want to return to teaching. The town seamstress worked overtime to create a wedding dress in cream-colored silk that made Josie look like something from a dream. Ethan spent his time preparing the ranch for Josie's arrival, making improvements to the cabin he had neglected when he lived alone. He built proper cupboards in the kitchen area, installed glass windows to replace the shuttered openings, constructed a real bedroom with walls instead of just a curtain. He wanted everything to be perfect for her. The marshal and his deputies finally concluded their search for the missing stagecoach passengers. They found the woman's body washed up on a bank 10 miles downstream, still wearing the wedding ring that identified her. The husband's body was never recovered. It was a somber reminder of how easily life could be lost, and how precious it was to find love and hold on to it. The wedding took place on a crisp November morning at the small church in Evanston. It seemed like half the town turned out, filling the pews and spilling out onto the front steps. Josie wore her cream silk dress with her mother's cameo at her throat, and she carried a bouquet of the last autumn wildflowers, purple asters and golden black-eyed Susans. Ethan stood at the front of the church in his best suit, his dark hair combed back, his hands clasped to keep them from shaking. When Josie appeared at the back of the church, walking down the aisle alone since she had no family to give her away, he felt his breath catch. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. The preacher spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about two people joining their lives and hearts. Ethan and Josie exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other through whatever trials might come. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed his bride with all the love and joy in his heart, and the church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration afterward at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was boisterous and warm. People brought food and music, and there was dancing in the parlor that had been cleared of furniture for the occasion. Ethan, who had always avoided social gatherings, found himself enjoying the festivities, mainly because Josie's happiness was so infectious. She danced with seemingly every man in town, but she always came back to him, her eyes shining, her smile radiant. As the sun began to set, they said their goodbyes and climbed into Ethan's wagon, now decorated with ribbons and tin cans that rattled behind them. People threw rice and called out good wishes as they drove away, heading toward their new life together. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them tired from the excitement of the day but content. Josie sat close to Ethan on the wagon seat, her head resting against his shoulder. He kept one arm around her, holding her secure as they navigated the familiar trail in the growing darkness. When they finally reached the cabin, Ethan reined in the horse and sat for a moment, just looking at his home. Their home now. Light from the lamps he had left burning spilled out through the windows, making the place look warm and welcoming. "It is perfect," Josie said softly, as if reading his thoughts. Ethan climbed down and came around to help her from the wagon, but instead of setting her on her feet, he swept her up in his arms. She laughed and wrapped her arms around his neck as he carried her up the porch steps and across the threshold. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Ethan had spent the morning making everything ready, building up the fire, putting fresh quilts on the bed, filling vases with the last of the season's wildflowers. It looked more like a home than it ever had when he lived here alone. He set Josie on her feet gently, and they stood together in the center of the room, suddenly shy despite the vows they had exchanged. This was new territory for both of them, this intimacy of marriage, this complete trust and vulnerability. "I want you to be happy here," Ethan said quietly. "If there is anything you need, anything you want to change, just tell me. I am already happy." Josie reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "I am exactly where I want to be, with exactly the person I want to be with. Everything else is just details." He kissed her then, slowly and thoroughly, and all the shyness fell away. This was Josie, his wife, the woman he loved more than anything else in the world. This was right and good and exactly how it was meant to be. Later, as they lay together in the darkness with the fire crackling softly in the hearth, Josie traced patterns on Ethan's chest and spoke into the silence. "Tell me about Rebecca." Ethan stiffened slightly. "How did you know about her? You mentioned once that someone had hurt you before." It was not hard to guess there was a woman involved. She raised herself up on one elbow to look at him. "I do not need all the details. I just want to understand what made you so afraid to open your heart again." He was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. "Rebecca and I grew up together in Kansas. We started courting when I was 19. I thought we would get married, build a life together. But then I became a deputy marshal, and she did not like what that meant. The danger, the violence, the uncertainty. She gave me an ultimatum. Give up the badge or lose her." "What did you do?" I tried to compromise. "I told her I would do it for a few more years to save money, then we could start fresh somewhere new. But she could not accept that. She married a shopkeeper 3 months later, someone safe and predictable." He looked at Josie in the firelight. "It made me feel like everything I was, everything I did was not enough, not worthy of love, so I came out here and decided I was better off alone." "But you were wrong," Josie said gently. "You are more than enough. You are exactly enough." Rebecca was not wrong to want safety and stability, but she was wrong to think she could not have those things with you. You are the most solid, dependable man I have ever met. I am glad you think so, because you are stuck with me now." He pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. "I love you, Josie Sullivan." "I love you too, Ethan Sullivan." She settled against him with a contented sigh. "I think I loved you from that very first night when you pulled me inside and built up the fire. You saved my life, and then you gave me a reason to live it." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the fire burning low, the Wyoming night peaceful and still around them. The first months of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Josie had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, the early rising and late nights, the physical demands of the work. Ethan had to get used to sharing his space, his life, his thoughts with another person after years of solitude. But they navigated these changes with patience and humor, learning each other's habits and preferences, finding their way together. Josie discovered she loved the ranch life more than she expected. She learned to ride a horse, though Ethan insisted she take only the gentlest mare. She learned to cook on the wood stove, to preserve vegetables for winter, to mend clothes and make soap. She also started teaching again, gathering the children from neighboring ranches twice a week for lessons in the cabin. It was not a traditional school, but it fulfilled her desire to educate while allowing her to remain at home. Ethan found that having Josie there transformed his entire existence. Work that had once felt like empty routine now had purpose, because he was building something for them both. The cabin that had been merely shelter became a true home, filled with Josie's laughter and music and warmth. He had not realized how lonely he had been until the loneliness was gone. They went into Evanston together once a month. Josie visiting with Mrs. Patterson and her other friends from town, while Ethan bought supplies and caught up on news. The town had changed in small ways. A new hotel had been built near the train station. The school had hired a young man fresh from Teachers College to replace Josie. The marshal had finally convinced the stagecoach company to modify their routes to avoid the dangerous river crossing during high water. Winter came early that year, blanketing the land in snow by mid-November. Ethan and Josie spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other, playing cards, talking about their dreams for the future. They spoke about expanding the ranch, maybe buying more land to the north. About the children they hoped to have someday. About growing old together in this place they were building on Christmas Eve. A blizzard rolled in from the mountains, fierce and howling. They were snowed in for 3 days, the world outside reduced to white chaos. But inside the cabin they were warm and safe, their stores of food and firewood keeping them comfortable. Josie said it was the best Christmas she ever had. Just the two of them and the storm raging outside, creating their own little world. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and bringing green back to the land, Josie had news. She told Ethan over breakfast one April morning, her eyes sparkling with excitement and nervousness. "I am with child. We are going to have a baby." Ethan set down his coffee cup carefully, his hand suddenly unsteady. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be. I have suspected for a few weeks, but I wanted to wait until I was sure before I told you." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Are you happy?" "Happy." He came around the table and pulled her up into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "Josie, I am beyond happy. I am overwhelmed, terrified, overjoyed." He set her down gently, suddenly concerned. "Should you be working so hard? Should you stop teaching? What do you need?" She laughed at his worry. "I need you to stop fussing. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am healthy and strong. We have months yet before anything needs to change." But things did change, slowly and beautifully. As summer ripened and Josie's belly grew round with their child, Ethan found himself watching her with constant wonder. She bloomed in pregnancy, her skin glowing, her eyes bright with anticipation. She continued teaching her small group of ranch children through July, then finally agreed to take a break as the summer heat and her size made things more uncomfortable. They prepared the cabin for the baby's arrival, Ethan building a cradle from pine he cut and planed himself, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. Josie sewed tiny clothes and blankets, sometimes getting tears in her eyes at how small they were, how miraculous it seemed that soon there would be a whole person wearing them. In late August, when the sun was scorching and the grasshoppers sang in the dry grass, Josie went into labor. Ethan rode hard to the nearest neighboring ranch, the Prescott place about 5 miles away, to fetch Mrs. Prescott, who had birthed 6 children of her own and helped deliver dozens more. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Ethan paced outside the bedroom like a caged animal, listening to Josie's cries and feeling utterly helpless. Mrs. Prescott came out periodically to update him, her face serious but not alarmed, reassuring him that everything was progressing normally. Finally, in the late afternoon, a new sound joined the symphony, the thin, outraged wail of a newborn. Ethan's heart leaped into his throat. Mrs. Prescott emerged from the bedroom, smiling broadly. "You have a son, Mr. Sullivan, a healthy, strong boy. Your wife is tired but doing well. Give me a few minutes to get her settled, then you can come in." A son. Ethan leaned against the wall, overwhelmed by emotion. He had a son. Josie had given him a son when Mrs. Prescott finally beckoned him inside. He entered the bedroom to find Josie propped up against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. And in her arms, wrapped in one of the blankets she had made, was a tiny red-faced creature with dark hair and impossibly small hands. "Come meet your son," Josie said softly. Ethan approached slowly, afraid he might break something just by breathing too hard. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby, his son, his child. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, Josie. Thank you for this gift. We made him together," she said, tears streaming down her face. What should we name him? They had discussed names for months but never quite decided. Now, looking at his son's serious little face, Ethan knew. "James, after your father, James Edward Sullivan." Josie's face crumpled and she cried harder, but they were happy tears. "My father would have been so proud. I wish he could have met our son. Tell me about him. Tell James about his grandfather." Ethan put his arm around Josie and carefully, terrified of doing it wrong, touched his son's impossibly soft cheek. "Tell us both." So Josie spoke about her father, the bookseller, about his love of stories and learning, about how he used to read to her every night before bed, about his kindness and his quiet strength, about how he had worked himself to exhaustion trying to keep his shop afloat and his daughter provided for. Baby James, who would never meet the man he was named for, nonetheless would grow up knowing him through his mother's stories. And Ethan, who had his own father to honor and remember, vowed that he would be the kind of father both their sons deserved, present and loving, strong but gentle. The weeks after James's birth were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. The baby seemed to need constant attention, feeding and changing and soothing around the clock. Josie bore the brunt of it, nursing him and tending to his every cry, but Ethan helped however he could. He would walk the floor with James at night when the baby was fussy, letting Josie get a few precious hours of sleep. He took over all the cooking and cleaning, learning to manage the household tasks Josie usually handled. Mrs. Prescott stayed for a week to help, teaching them both the mysteries of infant care. Other neighbors came by with food and gifts, welcoming the new baby into the community. Even Mrs. Patterson made the long trip from Evanston, bringing a beautiful hand-quilted blanket and exclaiming over how handsome young James was. As autumn arrived again, painting the mountains in gold and crimson, life began to settle into new rhythms. James grew and changed daily, his eyes focusing, his little hands learning to grasp. Josie slowly recovered her strength, and Ethan marveled at her resilience, at the way she adapted to motherhood as if she had been born for it. One evening in October, almost exactly a year after their wedding, they sat together on the porch in the last warm light of day. James slept in his mother's arms, his tiny rosebud mouth making sucking motions even in sleep. Ethan had his arm around Josie, and they watched the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You ever miss it?" Ethan asked quietly. "The life you had before, teaching in a real school, living in town, having people around all the time." Josie turned to look at him, and her eyes were warm and clear. "No, not even a little bit. This is exactly where I want to be. This is the life I was meant to have." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "A year ago I showed up at your door soaked from the river, half dead from cold, terrified and alone. You pulled me inside and built a fire. But you did more than that, Ethan. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me everything. You gave me everything too. I did not even know I was only half alive until you came along and woke me up." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you, Josie. I will love you every day for the rest of my life. And I will love you right back, Cowboy, every single day." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, the light turning gold and then rose and finally purple. Somewhere an owl hooted, beginning its nightly hunt. The horses nickered softly in the corral. The world spun on, vast and wild and beautiful. But here on this porch, in this moment, with his wife and son warm against him, Ethan Sullivan had everything he needed. The solitary life he had thought he wanted seemed like a distant dream now, pale and insubstantial compared to this vibrant, messy, wonderful reality. The years passed with surprising speed after James was born. Time seemed to move differently when marked by a child's milestones. James learned to crawl, then walk, then run with the fearless enthusiasm of a boy raised in wide open spaces. He learned to ride almost as soon as he could walk, perched in front of his father on the saddle, squealing with delight. Josie resumed her teaching when James was old enough, now bringing him along to the lessons. The ranch children adored him, and he grew up surrounded by friends and learning, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Ethan expanded the ranch gradually, buying adjacent land when it became available, building up his herds and his reputation. The Sullivan Ranch became known for producing some of the finest horses in Wyoming, and buyers came from as far as Montana and Colorado to look at his stock. When James was 3, Josie found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and she sailed through it with energy and good spirits. Their daughter was born on a snowy February morning, coming into the world with less fuss than her brother had, as if she knew she needed to be easy on her parents. They named her Margaret Rose, called Maggie from the start. She had Josie's dark eyes and Ethan's stubborn chin, and from the beginning, she was determined to keep up with her older brother no matter what he did. By the time she was 2, she was climbing trees and chasing chickens, and demanding to ride horses like James did. "We are raising a wild child," Josie said one afternoon, watching Maggie covered in mud from head to toe, grinning like it was the best thing that ever happened to her. "She is a ranch child," Ethan replied with amusement. "This is what they look like. I suppose you are right, though I had visions of teaching her to be a proper lady, needlework and manners and all that. You can teach her those things too. She can be both wild and proper, depending on what the situation calls for." He swept Maggie up, mud and all, making her giggle. "Right, little one, you can do anything you set your mind to." "Anything," Maggie agreed solemnly, then wiggled to be put down so she could go back to whatever mischief she had been making. 3 years later, their third and final child arrived, another boy they named Thomas after the marshal who had helped Josie when she first came to Evanston. Tom Sullivan was a quieter child than his siblings, more thoughtful and introspective. He preferred books to horses, drawing to riding, and Josie saw in him echoes of her father the bookseller. "Not every boy needs to be a cowboy," she told Ethan when he worried that Tom seemed too content staying inside. "Let him be who he is. The world needs thinkers as much as it needs ranchers." So they let Tom follow his own path, encouraging his love of learning, getting him books whenever they went to town. He would sit for hours with his pencils and paper, drawing the landscape around them with surprising skill for one so young. And when he did venture outside, it was to lie in the grass and watch clouds, to catch tadpoles in the creek and study them, to ask endless questions about how things worked and why. The Sullivan family became a fixture in the Evanston community. They went to church most Sundays when weather permitted, the 5 of them piled into the wagon. They attended town celebrations and barn raisings, helped neighbors when times were hard, were helped in return when they needed it. The children grew up knowing they were part of something larger than just their family, part of a community that looked out for each other. Josie never did return to teaching in a traditional school, but she taught her own children and any others whose parents brought them out to the ranch. Her reputation as an excellent teacher spread, and families would sometimes move to the area specifically because of the education she provided. She taught in the summers when ranch work was lighter, and the cabin would be filled with the sounds of children reciting lessons and asking questions. Ethan's ranch continued to prosper. He was a fair boss to the few hands he hired during busy seasons, and his reputation for honesty meant his word was as good as any contract. He served for a time on the town council, though he never enjoyed the politics of it. He was more comfortable with horses and open land than meetings and debates. But through all of it, through the busy years of raising children and building a business and becoming established members of their community, the love between Ethan and Josie never dimmed. If anything, it deepened and strengthened, tested by the challenges they faced and proven again and again. There were hard times, certainly. A winter when they lost half their cattle to a blizzard. A summer of drought when the creek ran dry and they had to haul water from miles away. The year James broke his arm falling from a horse, and they spent agonizing days worrying about infection. The autumn when Tom fell deathly ill with fever and they sat by his bedside for a week, praying he would recover. Through it all, they held to each other. When Ethan despaired, Josie reminded him of their strength and resilience. When Josie worried, Ethan provided steady calm and practical solutions. They became partners in every sense of the word, so intertwined in their thoughts and goals that sometimes they did not need words to communicate. The children grew like weeds, shooting up despite Josie's attempts to keep them small and manageable. James grew into a serious young man, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, taking on more and more responsibility at the ranch. By the time he was 16, he could do everything Ethan could do, and he did it with skill and dedication. Maggie grew into a beauty, though she seemed utterly unaware of it, more interested in breaking horses than breaking hearts. She had her mother's quick mind and her father's fearlessness, a combination that served her well in the rough country they called home. Boys from neighboring ranches started finding excuses to visit, and Ethan found himself having to restrain his protective instincts. "She is only 15, he grumbled to Josie after the third young man came calling in a week. "She is growing up whether you like it or not," Josie replied gently. "And she has a good head on her shoulders. Trust her to make smart choices." "I do trust her. It is those boys I do not trust." Josie laughed and kissed his cheek. "You sound like every father who ever lived. She will be fine, Ethan. We raised her to be strong and smart. Now we have to let her use those qualities." Tom remained the quiet one, happiest with his books and drawings. When he was 12, he announced he wanted to be an architect, designing buildings and bridges. Ethan had no idea how to support such an ambition, but Josie wrote letters to colleges back east, gathering information and making plans. Tom would need more education than they could provide, they realized. Eventually, he would need to leave Wyoming and pursue his dreams elsewhere. It was a bittersweet realization that their children would grow up and leave and make their own lives. But that was the natural order of things, the way it was supposed to be. They raised their children to be independent and capable, to pursue their passions and build their own happiness. They could not ask them to stay simply, because letting go was hard. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Josie to the place where they first met, back to his cabin where she had stumbled out of the night soaked from the river. The building was still standing, though they had long since built a larger house closer to the creek. They used the old cabin for storage now, a relic of their early days. They stood on the porch as the sun set, much older now but still holding hands like young lovers. Ethan put his arm around Josie and pulled her close. 20 years, he said. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime and sometimes it feels like yesterday. I know what you mean. Josie leaned into him, fitting against his side the way she always had. I still remember that night so clearly, how cold I was, how frightened. And then you opened that door, and I knew somehow that everything would be all right. I remember thinking you looked like a drowned cat, half dead and shivering. He smiled at the memory. And then I looked into your eyes and something in me recognized something in you. Like we were meant to find each other. We were meant to find each other. I believe that more than I believe almost anything else. She turned to face him, her hands on his chest. You are my home, Ethan Sullivan. Not this cabin, not this land, not even that beautiful house we built. You. Wherever you are, that is where I belong. He kissed her deeply. 20 years of love and partnership and shared life in that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both were teary-eyed but smiling. I love you, Josie. I will love you until I draw my last breath and beyond. And I love you. Thank you for pulling me inside that night. Thank you for building the fire. Thank you for giving me this extraordinary life. They stayed until full dark, wrapped in each other's arms, watching stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. Then they walked back to their house where their children waited, where their life continued to unfold in all its messy, beautiful glory. The years continued their steady march. James married a girl from Evanston, a sweet-natured rancher's daughter named Sarah, and they built a house on the far side of the Sullivan property. He and Ethan expanded the ranch together, father and son working side by side, building something they could pass to future generations. Maggie, true to her independent nature, announced at 19 that she was going to Montana to visit Aunt Catherine, Ethan's sister. She came back 6 months later engaged to a horse trader named Robert Shaw, a man who matched her spirit and strength. They married and settled in Evanston, where Robert opened a livery stable, and Maggie finally agreed to wear dresses sometimes, though she still preferred trousers when she thought she could get away with it. Tom left for Chicago at 18, accepted into a prestigious architecture program on a scholarship. It nearly broke Josie's heart to see him go, but she was fiercely proud too. They received letters from him regularly, full of descriptions of the great buildings he was studying, the bridges he was learning to design, the enormous city that both overwhelmed and excited him. As Ethan and Josie moved into their 50s, they gradually began to hand over more of the ranch operations to James. It was not that they were unable to do the work, but they had earned the right to slow down, to enjoy the fruits of their decades of labor. They traveled some, taking the train to visit Tom in Chicago, spending a summer in Montana with Catherine and her family. But they always came back to Wyoming, to the land that had brought them together and shaped their lives. They would sit on the porch of the house they built together, watching the sun set over mountains they knew as well as their own faces, and marvel at how full their life had been. Grandchildren came, a whole new generation of Sullivans. James and Sarah had 4 children in fairly rapid succession, filling the ranch with noise and laughter. Maggie and Robert added 3 more to the mix. Even Tom eventually married a woman he met in Chicago and brought her back to Wyoming to visit. Their 2 children wide-eyed at the vast spaces, so different from city life. Josie delighted in her role as grandmother, teaching the children to read and ride, telling them stories about their parents when they were young. Ethan took on the role of wise patriarch, passing down his knowledge of the land and animals, teaching his grandsons and granddaughters alike the skills they would need to thrive in this rugged country. On a spring morning when Ethan was 58 and Josie was 56, they rode out together to check on the new foals in the far pasture. It was something they had done countless times over the years, a familiar routine that never grew old. The day was perfect, warm but not hot, with a breeze carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. They sat on their horses side by side, watching the foals kick up their heels and race across the grass, their mothers grazing peacefully nearby. Ethan reached over and took Josie's hand, their fingers intertwining automatically. "We did all right, didn't we?" he said quietly. "We did better than all right. We built something lasting, something good." She squeezed his hand. "Do you remember what you told me the morning after I showed up at your cabin? You said I had saved my own life by making it through the river. But you were wrong, Ethan. You saved my life in every way that mattered. You gave me a reason to live, a purpose, a family, a home. You saved mine too. I was just existing before you came along, going through the motions. You taught me how to really live again, how to open my heart." He turned in his saddle to face her fully. "Every good thing in my life came from the moment I opened that door and found you on the other side." Tears streamed down Josie's face, but she was smiling her beautiful smile. "We were so young then, so uncertain about everything except how we felt about each other. And now we are old and certain about everything," Ethan joked, making her laugh through her tears. "Not old, just well-seasoned." She wiped her eyes. "Promise me something, Ethan, anything. Promise me that no matter what comes, no matter how many years we have left together, we will never take this for granted. This love, this life we built. Promise me we will treasure every single day. I promise." "Every day with you is a treasure, Josie. Every single one." They rode back to the house together as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Two people who had started as strangers and become one heart, one soul, one life intertwined so completely that they could no longer imagine existence any other way. That evening, with their children and grandchildren gathered around the dinner table, the house full of noise and laughter and love, Ethan looked around and felt gratitude so profound it almost overwhelmed him. This was legacy. This was purpose. This was what it meant to truly live. And it all started with a woman who showed up at his door, soaked from the river, and a cowboy who pulled her inside and built a fire. The years that followed continued to be full and rich. Ethan and Josie aged gracefully, their hair turning silver, their faces mapping the years with well-earned lines. But their love remained as strong and bright as ever, a beacon for their children and grandchildren to follow. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the family threw an enormous celebration at the ranch. People came from miles around, some of them friends from those early days in Evanston, others newer additions to their circle. Marshall Bradshaw, now long retired and leaning on a cane, made the trip to offer his congratulations. Mrs. Patterson, impossibly old but still sharp as a tack, declared she had known from the first moment that Ethan and Josie were meant to be together. There was food and music and dancing under the stars. Ethan and Josie danced together, moving slowly now but still perfectly in sync, while their family and friends watched with misty eyes. When the dancing ended, Ethan raised his glass in a toast. 40 years ago, I opened my door to find a woman who changed my life in every possible way. She brought light into my darkness, hope into my despair, love into my carefully guarded heart. She gave me children and grandchildren, a legacy beyond anything I ever imagined. But most of all, she gave me herself, every day for 40 years, and I am the luckiest man who ever lived because of it." He turned to Josie, his eyes bright with emotion. "To my wife, my partner, my best friend, my everything, thank you for showing up at my door that night. Thank you for staying. Thank you for loving me even when I was too afraid to ask for it. You are the greatest blessing of my life." Everyone raised their glasses and cheered, but Josie only had eyes for Ethan. She stood and kissed him while their family and friends applauded. And for that moment, they were young again, standing under the cottonwood trees as the sun set, promising forever. They lived many more years together, watching their grandchildren grow and begin to build their own lives. They saw Tom's first major building completed, a beautiful library in Denver that bore a plaque with his name. They attended James's eldest son's wedding, a continuation of the Sullivan legacy on the land they had worked so hard to build. They held Maggie's first great-grandchild, marveling that they had lived long enough to see 4 generations. When Ethan passed away at 79, it was peacefully in his sleep with Josie beside him. She held his hand as he drew his last breath, whispering that she loved him, that she would follow when it was her time, that she would find him again wherever souls went after this life ended. She lived for 3 more years after his death, years she spent writing down their story for the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, wanting them to know how it all began. She described that night when she stumbled out of the river, half dead from cold and fear. She wrote about the cowboy who pulled her inside and built a fire, who saved her life in every way that mattered. She told their love story with all its joy and challenges, its triumphs and sorrows, its perfect, imperfect beauty. On the anniversary of their first meeting, exactly 50 years after she showed up at his door soaked from the river, Josie passed away quietly in her sleep. Her children found her in the morning, a smile on her face, their father's photograph clutched in her hands. They buried her beside Ethan on a hill overlooking the ranch, the mountains standing guard in the distance, the land they loved spreading out around them in every direction. Their descendants continued the ranch, generation after generation, building on the foundation that Ethan and Josie had laid. The old cabin where they met was preserved and maintained, becoming a family shrine of sorts, a reminder of where it all began. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would visit it, hearing the story again and again, how their grandmother showed up at their grandfather's door soaked from the river, and how the cowboy pulled her inside and built a fire, and how that single act of kindness and compassion bloomed into a love that shaped decades and touched hundreds of lives. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the pines and the sun painted the mountains in shades of gold, some said you could still feel their presence there. 2 souls so intertwined that not even death could separate them completely. They remained part of the land they loved, woven into the fabric of the place they had built together, their love story echoing through time as a testament to the power of opening one's heart, of taking a chance on love, of building a life with someone who sees the best in you even when you cannot see it yourself. Their story became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations, adapted and embellished but always true in its essential core. A woman in trouble finding refuge with a man who had given up on love. 2 wounded souls who found healing in each other. A partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection that weathered every storm and emerged stronger. The Sullivan Ranch continued to thrive well into the 20th century, eventually modernizing but never losing its essential character. And every generation knew the story of their beginning, knew that everything they had, every opportunity and blessing, could be traced back to one cold night in 1878 when Josephine Bennett showed up at Ethan Sullivan's door soaked from the river, and the cowboy pulled her inside and built a fire, and love did the rest. It was a story of survival and second chances, of courage and kindness, of 2 people who found in each other exactly what they needed most. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest acts of compassion, that opening your door to someone in need might just open your heart to possibilities you never imagined. and it was a love story for the ages, playing out against the backdrop of the American West, proving that even in the harshest landscape, even in the most unforgiving times, love could take root and flourish and create something beautiful that would last for generations. The sun set on another day at the Sullivan Ranch, painting the sky in familiar shades of orange and gold. Somewhere children laughed and horses nickered and life continued its eternal dance. And in the old cabin preserved on the hillside, you could almost hear the echo of a knock at the door, the sound of a man's surprised voice, the crackle of a fire being built against the cold. It all began there in that moment of choosing kindness over caution, compassion over convenience. In that moment, when Ethan Sullivan opened his door to Josephine Bennett and pulled her inside to safety and warmth. That choice, made in an instant but reverberating through decades, proved what the Sullivan family knew in their bones and taught to every generation. That love is the greatest legacy, that family is built through devotion and sacrifice, and that sometimes the best things in life come to us soaked and shivering and desperate, asking only for a warm fire and a safe place to rest. And if we are wise enough and brave enough to pull them inside, to tend to them with care and compassion, we might just find that we were the ones being saved all along.